translate. Simulacra.
Alors, bonjour. Je ne sais pas ce matin qui a déjà vu une exposition de Tony Oursler, mais ceux-là savent à quel point cet artiste a développé depuis plus de 30 ans une œuvre absolument à part, fondée sur des dispositifs visuels qui sont à la fois fascinants et un peu dérangeants. Il y a des globes oculaires qui parlent, il y a des apparitions spectrales qui animent des poupées de chiffon ou qui se manifestent là où on ne les attend pas, sur des façades, sur des troncs d'arbres. Au cœur de la nuit, on est plus proche parfois du terrifiant que du merveilleux. Mais ce qui est sûr, c'est que les œuvres de Tony Oursler portent toujours une part de mystère qui fait qu'on ne les oublie pas. Et aujourd'hui, Tony présente à l'Atelier des Forges une exposition sous forme de film et d'installation. C'est une exposition réalisée à partir d'une collection qu'il a réunie depuis une quinzaine... Pardon, je reprends. C'est une exposition réalisée à partir d'une collection qu'il a réunie depuis une quinzaine d'années. Une collection tout à fait fabuleuse de documents, de photographies, d'objets qui ont tous à voir avec la question du phénomène visuel, qu'il soit réel ou virtuel. L'exposition est produite par la Fondation Luma et elle a pour commissaires Beatrix Roof et Tom Eccles. Et je le précise, il y a également un catalogue, mais alors que je vous recommande absolument d'acheter. Il y a une signature après. Je ne le dis pas à chaque fois, mais alors ce catalogue est absolument remarquable. Voilà.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tony Oursler, je vais commencer par une question finalement très simple. Quand et comment avez-vous démarré cette collection?
The collection... The collection began probably in earnest began in the mid-90s when I started to reconsider the notion of the history of multimedia and thinking about the camera obscura and the fact that most plastic art forms have a very delineated historical framework to work from, but multimedia art has a kind of lost history. So I kind of constructed a timeline for myself over 3 or 4 years, which culminated in a project actually with one of the curators here, the Influence Machine. So I began collecting then.
Mm-hmm. Mais vous aviez déjà auparavant commencé à vous intéresser à toute cette histoire de l'optique. Vous aviez déjà monté des projets dans des musées où vous remontiez finalement toute l'histoire de l'optique et du visuel. C'est pas votre première tentative.
In the mid-90s was basically when I really started looking at that as a topic. So, I mean, I had a few things around, but that was really it, like 95, 96. Mm-hmm. And then I did a series of installations in different places that corresponded with my interest in that, the deep, then sort of around the camera obscura projection on eyes, large spheres, and then some larger format installations related to the invention of television and like that.
Mm-hmm. Alors, vous avez hérité alors, vous avez un certain nombre de pièces. Vous pouvez peut-être nous dire combien de pièces il y a dans votre collection. Vous peut-être nous la décrire.
As you said, the collection in a strange way began much before that, but it was not really, I was not really interested in necessarily primary pieces, so that began in the late 90s. And so what I mean by primary is like first edition books, things like that. I started really buying in the 90s, but I guess I have maybe 3,000 images and objects, maybe 3 to 4,000.
Les pièces les plus anciennes, c'est quoi?
Medieval, probably, but only a very few like that.
Alors c'est quoi, par exemple?
They would be like just clippings from old manuscripts, graphics, probably related to the occult.
Et les pièces les plus récentes, qu'est-ce que ce serait?
Well, there's a whole category that's left out of this of contemporary art that I like to collect as well, but it wasn't really germane to this project. So I have things, very contemporary. I'm interested in all sorts of technology, so I'm gathering material around facial recognition right now.
Ah oui.
And those are mostly digital images, which is a very ephemeral thing. So.
Alors, je vais compléter un peu, du coup, ce qu'on trouve dans cette collection. Pour ceux qui n'ont pas été encore allés voir l'exposition, ce sont des lanternes magiques, ce sont des documents en code morse, ce sont des photographies de la pensée, ce sont des rayons X, ce sont des volumes antiques sur la magie, ce sont des pamphlets de nouvelles sectes religieuses. C'est tout ce qui a lieu, finalement, un peu à l'occulte ou au spiritisme, aux manifestations visuelles dont on ne s'explique pas toujours l'origine.
Well,
est-ce que j'ai bien résumé ou vous voulez compléter?
No, it's not all occult. So there's the notion of a thread through the entire archive is really belief systems. And what we have is, that drifting into the occult, but then it goes into, religion, then it goes into the notion of the face, also the history of optics is in there, but all these things kind of intertwine in different ways and are valenced around belief systems. So it's not fair to categorize it all as a cult.
Alors, vous avez hérité de certaines de ces pièces, je crois, parce que la fascination pour l'étrange, pour la magie, pour le merveilleux, si j'ai bien compris, c'est une tradition familiale. Alors, est-ce qu'on peut commencer par parler de votre fameux grand-père?
Absolutely. Fulton is present here, and my grandmother too. Yeah, okay. So what we've got is a small chunk of the archive which kind of inspired the project, which has to do with material that was sent in a correspondence between Arthur Conan Doyle and Fulton Oursler, my grandfather. And I grew up with some of this material when I was a kid.
Et c'était quoi? What was it?
Well, there was probably 7 images. And just to give a little bit of background, Fulton was a writer, magician, and a convert to to Catholicism later in life. And notably, when he converted to Catholicism, he wrote a very well-known book, bestseller, called The Greatest Story Ever Told. So in a sense, he starts out as a writer. The first book he ever wrote was a handwritten book, which is in our book represented, and it was a Sherlock Holmes mystery when he was like 12 years old, on paper that was used to wrap bread in. And so he was always a detective writer, a mystery writer. He was obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe. So the Gothic sort of starts with him. He also grew up underneath the seance table. So he had an aunt who was some kind of medium. So he went to numerous seances. And he was later friends with Houdini. So Houdini was a big exposer and debunker of mystics and mediums, as was my grandfather. Apparently,
Le grand magicien aussi.
No, he wasn't a great magician, but he never thought he was good. He was amateur magician, but he became friends with Houdini and other people. So he had this interesting relationship with Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle, people may or may not know here, probably because if you know art history, photo art history, you'll know about the images of the Cottingley fairies. Are people familiar with those? Yeah, some people, yeah, okay. But we can talk about those just briefly. It was a phenomenon in the 20s where two young girls in Britain took pictures of fairies and elves in the woods, and it kind of became this phenomenon, a global phenomenon, through the Theosophists and through primarily Arthur Conan Doyle, who promoted and wrote a book on the subject. And the girls were sort of caught up in this thing. Obviously, they set up these very simple cutouts. And anyway, fast forward, Conan Doyle sends an image to my grandfather. He also sends to try to convince him that these things are real. And he sends 4 or 5 other images, one related to spirit photography, one related to ectoplasm, one related to a kind of materialization of life through salt crystals from blood, and one related to William Crookes and Katie King, the famous scientist William Crookes, who invented the cathode ray tube, which was responsible for television and then the X-ray. He fell in with mediums in the 1800s and did a lot of experimentation on that and was roundly criticized by people like Faraday and like that. So this 4 or 5 images, which my grandfather reproduced in an article against these images, kind of showing that they were false, but were kind of given to me to look at when I was very little, like 4 or 5 years old, 6 years old. They were lost for many years, and then my mother and father gave them to me in the late 90s, again, like around 2000. They surfaced in the house and they were gifted to me. And so they entered my collection at that point and sort of birthed this project here. And there were a couple of points where this project was born. One was in the late 90s, and then one was a couple of years ago with talking with Beatrix and Tom about the veracity of the photographic image, which Fulton and Arthur Conan Doyle had a dialogue about, which you can see then in the response to the archive, which is the film in the theater there. So they had a dialogue around how spirit photography was produced and whether it was real or not. So Fulton, being a magician and a debunker and a journalist, knew how to make fake spirit photographs. Conan Doyle had a system for vetting out the spirit photo. Like he had a system, that to prove which spirit photos were real and which were fake. And so they had this kind of interesting dialogue back and forth, which the interesting thing about this subject is that it kind of zooms out into the way that modernism and sort of existentialism is entering the culture at the time. There's a lot of ramifications: women's emancipation, women's vote, the various world wars that were just about to occur, and so there's battling political systems. So in a way, it's inherent in these belief systems around some of this material.
Mm-hmm. Mais ce qui est toujours très fascinant dans tous ces personnages du début du siècle, c'est qu'on a le sentiment qu'ils sont toujours entre la croyance dans le merveilleux et en même temps une forme de retrait par rapport à cette crudité. Et on n'arrive jamais à comprendre, parce que nous sommes devenus beaucoup plus rationnels d'une certaine façon, comment à cette époque on peut produire un personnage comme le Sherlock Holmes, qui est quelqu'un qui traque la réalité et les impostures, et en même temps croire à les photos des faits. Des photos de fées.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting perspective, and this was a kind of where the connection between the past and the present, it seems tenuous, but the further you inspect it, you start to see that, okay, what happens is, how could a grown man believe that fairies and elves exist in the woods, which I still am just absolutely fascinated by. But around this project.
Vous n'y croyez pas, vous? You don't believe?
No comment. What's fascinating is then around this project, I started to look at, okay, what are belief systems today? For example, 60% of the public believes in ESP. Say 1 in 3 people in America does not believe in evolution. There's also probably 70% of the public believes in UFOs. So you have a kind of sense of rationality on the surface, but the question about this project is that really what's happening or not? You know, because as soon as you start to really inspect people's belief systems, you find that, you know, your friend just came back from a Wicca wedding, and someone else saw a UFO, and someone believes they got a message from somebody. So it quickly breaks down, and that, you know, smoothing out and breaking down is something I'm very interested in my art making, which has kind of gone back through all my work for my whole life, really. But it's not so clear as you think.
Non, c'est pas limpide. Et d'ailleurs, en voyant donc le parcours de votre grand-père puis de votre père, alors j'ai vu que votre père était directeur de la rédaction de Reader's Digest, donc ce qui est une parution très sérieuse, très documentée. Et puis en même temps, il était fondateur d'un magazine qui s'appelle Angels on Earth, les anges sur terre. Et j'ai regardé sur Internet, et c'est un magazine qui existe toujours.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's very proud. I'm very proud of him for that. And yeah, he came out of retirement to start that magazine. And he was very successful at Reader's Digest and wrote a number of books, sponsored many books, won some notable books, you know, early research into anti-cigarette campaigns and things like that, but also the Alex Haley book, Roots. He worked with Alex Haley on commissioning that for Reader's Digest. So he did a lot of really interesting things. And when he came out of, I talked to him one evening while he was smoking a cigar, watching TV, and he said, you know, I have this idea for a magazine I really want to start. And I said to him, oh, that's interesting. You know, you did a lot of things. You came out of retirement once already to work on a magazine, and what's the idea? You know, maybe you should just enjoy your, you know, retirement. And he said, you know, I want to do a magazine about angels. And so it has, I was kind of shocked. I thought, oh, this is going to be sad because this will never be a success. You know, he'll like come out of retirement to make a very strange magazine about angels. And in fact, the strange thing about the magazine is that it's really about angels that exist on Earth. It's called Angels on Earth. And so there's a kind of quotation in the movie around one of the stories that I remember in there. And it really has to do with kind of actually neurological, you know, disturbances and near-death experiences and things like that. So people, questions of whether people actually hallucinate angels or helpers, and this is a kind of thing that's been going on for quite a long time. So I thought, yeah, this magazine will be a super failure, but actually it became quite successful because it had a very new age following. So there's a whole group of people who are into angels and how they appear. And I guess the notion is he collected stories from people who actually experienced encounters with angels, which is interesting because they say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, because I collected some stories of people in the 80s who had encounters with aliens and used those in my artwork. So I felt like a kindred spirit there.
Tenez, Oursler, si j'insiste autant justement sur votre filiation, c'est parce que voilà, j'ai presque une curiosité qui est: quelle enfance vous avez eue dans une famille pareille? Est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui... Est-ce qu'on faisait tourner les tables chez vous? Est-ce qu'on convoquait les esprits? Enfin, est-ce que votre grand-père vous a appris des tours de magie? Enfin, est-ce que c'est vraiment quelque chose qui...
Oh, no.
Non. Ah non.
No,
J'aurais
no,
pensé.
you have to understand that, no, my grandfather was very anti-spiritualism, so, as was my father. So, but they were Catholics, so there's a kind of distinguishing between the kind of mysticism, which is brought up in the film here, you know, the kind of irony of which perspective one takes on their mystical experiences. And, you know, growing up in that, I had like a typical 60s, 70s experience, you know, with a mixture of, certainly there was always this waves of occult, I remember, but everybody in America played with Ouija boards and things like that. But mine was more marked by rock and roll and psychedelia and kind of punk. I became a sort of punk, I guess, proto-punk, but
J'ai entendu que enfant, I heard, quand enfant, vous construisiez des maisons hantées dans la cave de votre maison, que vous aviez élevé un poisson-chat, que vous aviez pris dans le fleuve Hudson et vous lui aviez appliqué des simulations pour le faire évoluer, respirer et développer des jambes pour marcher. Donc quand même, vous étiez bien allumé, vous aussi.
Yeah, no, I fancied myself kind of scientist, you know, and I probably, if I had my way, I would have been interested, more of a scientist. But yeah, that was just a story about naivete of science and my youth. But, you know, what I would like to say is that storytelling is a subtext and the generation of language. So I grew up in a kind of Irish Catholic family where storytelling was really important. And so everything was kind of interpreted through the lens of language and story. And then there's another side of image making. You know, I kind of was a painter and had a great aunt who was a painter. So, but you know, in this project, there's the notion of writing and the transformative quality of writing is kind of in the background, whether it's with my grandmother who wrote many books, or my mother who's just a great storyteller, or my father who's a magazine guy, and my grandfather and grandmother who were both writers, so wrote many, many books. And kind of connecting that to the use of language as to develop agency. So you have like Marjorie Crandon, who's a medium in a time when women didn't have the vote, and she's using language in a kind of Freudian therapy setting, and using that as a way of expressing herself and having agency in society. So, and this is also really interesting.
Ce que vous êtes en train de me dire, c'est que d'une certaine façon, tous ces phénomènes paranormaux, tous ces gens qui ont exploré des univers un peu hors normes, étranges, hors société, permettent finalement de dresser un portrait d'une époque, voire d'une société, que c'est aussi une façon de raconter une histoire de l'Amérique, mais une histoire parallèle.
I should mention to people that just clearly that the way that the exhibition is presented is, okay, we have a book which has a run of 1,200 images, and it has 10 scholarly texts with it. So you have the approach of...
Le livre est la partie scientifique, on va dire.
Yeah, And then that's connected to a byproduct of that, which is a very small section of the archive, which is turned into a film. So, and that's focusing on the family side of it. We could have this entire conversation about optics or the phantasmagoria or cults or any other, you know, automatic writing or psychology, many other aspects of the archive. But the family story and the relationship between mysticism between World War I and World War II in America and in England and in France to some degree, kind of connects together. So you have my perspective, which is that history, which interweaves a family story with a kind of historical perspective. But then, you know, in the back of the book, you have these scholarly texts on Mesmer, on thought photography, on the phantasmagoria, on the transition between magic and film, focusing largely on what happened here in France with Georges Méliès, and then UFO photography, and on like that, and belief systems in general. So there's a lot of different perspectives that we try to open up in the archive so that it can be translated. It's not really just limited to one thing. We're taking one of the microcosms from the archive and blowing it up into this small feature film.
Mais là encore, on a le sentiment finalement que vous jouez sur les deux terrains, c'est-à-dire qu'on a, pour ceux qui n'ont pas vu le film, un personnage conducteur qui est Conan Doyle, donc qui est d'une certaine façon l'enquêteur, celui qui va voir un peu si tous ces phénomènes sont fondés ou pas, et qui est prêt à jouer, qui est très joueur, qui est prêt à rentrer dans le merveilleux et prêt à en sortir. Et puis l'autre personnage quand même, important du film, c'est Mina, effectivement, dont on ne sait jamais si elle est un vrai médium ou si elle est quelqu'un qui fabule. Et voilà. Donc on est avec des personnages qui sont tous les deux très antagonistes et qui sont en miroir l'un de l'autre. Donc vous jouez tout le temps sur ce double jeu et on ne sait jamais dans le film où on est, et on sait d'autant moins que c'est un film en 4D, donc on a un phénomène de relief, donc on a une première image, et une deuxième image, et une troisième image. Donc à chaque moment, le spectateur est convié à rentrer dans l'image et à en sortir, à adhérer à un personnage et à ne plus y adhérer. Donc tout ça, c'est une grande opération de déstabilisation.
Well, I love your perspective that it's destabilizing. When working with Luma, you know, we had a very, very sophisticated team to kind of re-examine the archive. And one of their missions from...
Oui, excusez-moi, je vous coupe. Parce que je dois préciser que les commissaires avec qui j'ai parlé m'ont dit que quand ils étaient allés chez vous, vos archives étaient dans des boîtes. Donc tout ça était dans une espèce de grand fouillis. Vous aviez ce trésor, mais vous ne l'aviez pas mis en forme, peut-être vous ne l'aviez pas pensé. Et donc tout ça s'est fait avec les commissaires qui ont peu à peu, avec vous, mis en place un système de pensée.
Yeah, so if we go back to the beginning with the curators, so we have Hans Ulrich, we have Beatrix Roof, we have Tom Eccles, Maya Hoffman, Philippe Perreno, the artist, some of my colleagues on there, Philippe Perreno, and Liam Gillick, were all part of the Luma team, as people may or may not know. And so when we began working on the project, we started with, okay, let's define what's in the archive. So it was all in boxes, and it was a very private activity for me, collecting. It was something that I did while I was traveling. Even here, passing the flea market on the way, you know, I thought, oh, I have to stop, but then I'll be late for this talk. You know, it's something that I love to do, this kind of collecting, finding things, associating with them.
Justement, on fait juste une petite aparté. Vous les achetez où? Vous les trouvez où? Sur eBay? Vous faites le tour du monde? Vous avez des gens qui collectionnent pour vous?
Yeah, well, I've been lucky enough to be able to travel around the world with my work. So one of my habits was when I'm in town, I would first start going to bookstores and then looking at print places and like that, and getting to know things like that. So I would collect a version of a theosophy book in Helsinki or something, and then when I was in Paris, coming to meet Francois and Alan Pavia, and taking a look at their amazing material and so forth like that. But also eBay friends who were also dealers or collectors. And so you just get to talk to people about it and find things. So I amassed a certain amount of things, had them categorized, but it was very hermetic, you know, as a kind of private activity. And so a big part of this project was to be able to kind of take this stuff and to present it to people, which was very exciting because collecting in itself has a kind of selfish attitude to it, you know, that you have all this stuff that's yours, you know, which I never really felt. I just liked to look at it. It wasn't about ownership. It was about looking at the material and studying it and free associating it, you know. And so discussing with the Luma team about how to approach that, the first thing we did was kind of get it in order, document it very simply with small cameras, and then later with a very beautiful photography to kind of photograph the stuff and categorize it. And that was the first step. And the second step was how to react to it, you know. So this team had a very sophisticated approach to that, which was at once open but very precise.
Et le choix de faire un film, ça s'est imposé comment? Et ce film-là, un film en 4D?
Well, the most obvious thing to do with an archive is to show the archive. And of course, that's not what the team at Luma was going to do. We thought that, okay, we put the images in a book and make a sort of small study center or kind of library setting, which is not too serious because it's got like a popcorn machine and a Coke machine in it, but a place where people can sit down and experience some lectures that are from the book, generated through the scholarly text in the book, and that there would be, okay, my reaction to my own archive, you know, which I had been reacting to it all along in a very subtle way, but then in a very, you know, to really attack it head on, which took me, you know, about a year to think about how I could do that. And we thought, okay, a film would be an interesting way to do it. Now, how the 2D, the 3D, 4D aspect of the film came about was that, of course, we didn't want to make just a classic film. We wanted to try to do something that reflected the magical quality of some of this material, of some of the phantasmagorical aspects, some of the notions of building constructed worldviews through technology. And one of my favorite technological devices is known as the Pepper's Ghost. And are people familiar with the Pepper's Ghost? No. Okay. Pepper's Ghost was anytime you...
Alors, il faut peut-être dire déjà qui était John Henry Pepper. Il y a un certain nombre de personnages qui viennent de façon récurrente. Donc il y a Houdini, il y a Méliès, pas forcément dans le film, mais ce sont les grands personnages qui... Voilà. Et il y a donc Mina, qui est la médium, vous pouvez d'autres personnages, peut-être que vous pouvez nommer, et John Henry Pepper.
Yeah, well, so like, there's the characters of the film, but there's the technology developed in the late 1800s by two people in a polytechnic in London, I believe it is, and they used a glass to reflect live performers to achieve like a live double exposure in the glass. And you might wonder, well, what does that look like? Anytime you see a glass window and you see a reflection in it, you're basically experiencing a Pepper's Ghost. But he took that idea and controlled the density of light on either side of the piece of glass and allowed him to do a kind of live double exposure, which is a wonderful thing, which strangely I had been using in my videos since the 70s, really, and early 80s, and before I even knew what a Pepper's Ghost was. So and it's important in a number of ways for us in the photography world here. You're going to think about immediately the double exposure and the history, the strange history of spirit photography, and how the first mistakes in photography became, valenced in terms of spiritualism. And these moments when technology is presented to the public before it becomes codified, all these fascinating things can happen with it. And Pepper's Ghost was something that had a very short-lived life in theater. And even in film, I recently discovered on this project there were some Pepper's Ghost films made, but there's very little known about them. So at a certain point, I realized I should use this technology because we thought, okay, it would be great to use a hologram projection or something, and actually.
Oui, parce qu'en fait, c'est l'ancêtre de l'holographie, ce qu'il a créé.
Yeah, and that's what we used in the film here as a kind of holographic effect, but it turns out to be based on the very old technology. So we used this notion of layering the film. So it exists on 2 layers, so you have kind of 2 focal planes, at least 2. Then we build in actually 3 and 4 sometimes, so you have an image that moves like this, and it's not created by glasses. You can see it with your eyes.
Tony Oursler, c'est très bien que vous parliez de John Henry Pepper, parce que Henry Pepper a donc fait ces dispositifs automatiques. Et à son époque, il était perçu comme un grand savant, un professeur. Il était directeur honoraire de la Royal Polytechnic Institution de London. Et si je m'attarde sur lui, c'est qu'on pourrait considérer que le monde de la magie et le monde des sciences et de la technologie, d'une certaine façon, sont en opposition. Et plus on avance, et plus les technologies, finalement, aujourd'hui, nous permettent de réaliser des choses qui, autrefois, relevaient de la magie. La question de l'holographie en est un exemple. Est-ce que magie et science sont antagoniques ou finalement ou sont absolument intrinsèquement liés? Toute votre œuvre est à la fois magique et complètement basée sur une technologie ultra perfectionnée.
Yeah, you hit on a good point there. One of the interesting things about film and television is that they're based on a persistence of vision, and one could even say the same about photography, that there's a willing suspension of disbelief involved with it. So you have at one point this technological development where you get moving images and a sort of simulacra of the world, but one could imagine a moment where you could just not believe it. You could just say, I'm not going to believe that there are people moving around in the movie theater. You could do that. You could just keep looking at the people next to you in the seat. And, some of my favorite theorists on this is like the situationists talked a lot about the spectacle. And, Brecht talked about that, like breaking down the relationship between the illusion of theater and the audience to get to a different place. And so these are the people that I'm really thinking about in terms of, you call it magic, but we could call it, I think Brecht called it the Z effect, which had to do with this point.
Z? C'est quoi l'effet Z?
Yeah, I think something like that. I might have it wrong, but which had to do with getting the audience to realize that they're participating actually in an artwork rather than being mesmerized and in a kind of subjective state. So some people call that magic, but also the notion that when we make these technological leaps, you have to sort of change perspective to allow it to register in certain ways. So there's a moment when the invention of film or television it is completely open, and the same thing happens with the internet. The internet emerges, no one knows what to do with it. So there's a moment where it's a free space, and then it becomes more corporatized and monetized, and we sort of figure out the way to use it, which is sanctioned by Sorry about that.
It's okay. It's the magic.
I think it's the dust in the air.
Ah, c'est possible. En tous les cas, chaque nouvelle technologie fait toujours l'objet d'un questionnement culturel. Chaque nouvelle technologie... Oui, chaque nouvelle technologie fait l'objet d'un questionnement culturel. Ça fascine, ça effraie en même temps. Il y a des nouvelles technologies qui ont l'air de relever de la science-fiction et qui peu à peu vont intégrer notre quotidien. Est-ce qu'il y a des évolutions technologiques que vous espérez ou des évolutions que vous redoutez dans le domaine, je ne sais pas, peut-être de l'optique ou du virtuel? Une question très simple. Quand elles vont sortir, est-ce que vous allez acheter les lunettes de réalité virtuelle d'Apple?
Well, probably. I mean, my son will force me to buy them. He's 11, so he has to have all the video games. I mean, I don't really have any fear of technology. For me, it's always been like, for a painter, they get maybe a few different colored paints every year or two. But for a multimedia artist, you have this chance to have new technologies to work with. So I find it very exciting. I'm not really scared of it. What I'm scared of is the separation between physicality and virtual space. And I think that there's a kind of balancing act, the amount of time people spend. Of course, my generation spent a lot of time in front of the TV. And probably, I think statistically, my generation spent more time in front of the TV than they did anything else except sleep. And I see it now with my son's generation, which is video games. And so there's a drug-like quality to certain technology as it gets better and better. It's just hard to make a balance because I believe in making things, and I think that there can be a counterproductive quality to the escapism of technology. And so I'm interested in these 3D printers and this kind of technology that kind of takes the virtual and brings it back to reality. So you can actually, like a kid could then, instead of leaving the door broken, they could actually print the new hinge for the door, while they're playing a video game, I suppose. I don't know, but if that makes sense.
C'est drôle que vous parliez de cette technologie, l'imprimante 3D qui part d'une certaine façon d'un virtuel et d'une image en tous les cas et qui revient à un objet réel. Parce que moi, je voulais vous parler d'un autre objet qui était... on voit tout le temps apparaître de nouveaux types d'images, mais il y a aussi de nouvelles technologies qui font disparaître les images. Je pense notamment à l'application Snapchat. Est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui vous a intrigué, Snapchat? Est-ce que c'est pas une nouvelle version de l'image fantomatique?
Something. Yeah, I mean, people translate technology into all these sort of, archetypal, almost Jungian language when they don't have a new language for it. So the ghost is just something that changes over time, like thousands of different, ways, But I'm in love with Instagram and things like that. And but again, I think it's just how much time one spends. I think the problem is it's really a balance of time. One of the things about plastic arts is that you have to spend a certain amount of time practicing actually making things. And that scares me because I'm actually, although I love technology, I really make things. I actually make things all the time. Or I work with people who make actual things, images. But the problem is confusing certain technologies with with activity, because I think certain activities are really non-activities, but you have the illusion of activity. So it's very slippery because it's just another way of being seduced into advertising it, for lack of a better word, you know. When they figure out a way, someone figures out a way for you to be transfixed so that you're in the position to be advertised to or part of a corporation, then it becomes problematic.
Mais pourtant, vous aussi, d'une certaine façon, dans vos œuvres, vous travaillez sur une subjugation du spectateur. Il y a un moment où vous l'emportez dans votre univers à vous.
Well, one of the things about the way that we wanted to design the theater was, again, coming back to the image of the Pepper's ghost and the new holographic images that we're producing in the film, is that there's so much change, and there's some other effects that happen in the theater that kind of bring you back to your body, that make you understand that you're in a film.
Je pensais pas forcément au film, je pensais aussi à votre œuvre. In general.
I always keep the technology exposed, so you always know what's happening. And there's a kind of balance between myself, the artwork, and the viewer, where there's a kind of triangulation where we're all constructing the image together. And there's a certain awareness of that happening all the time. So I like to play with that, that there's a participation happening at the moment. So you see these images on different layers or with the projections, but you're also keenly aware that there's a projector there and that
Alors,
we're all making it together.
est-ce que justement, vous, effectivement, dans vos installations muséales, effectivement, il y a toujours la part de technique qui est révélée. Est-ce que c'est pour enlever, d'une certaine façon, le côté orwellien de ce que pourraient avoir aussi vos installations, avec ces globes oculaires qui parlent, avec ces images qui surgissent de nulle part? Est-ce que le fait que justement vous montriez l'envers du décor, que d'où ça part, quelle machine, ça permet d'enlever justement le côté absolument inquiétant de ce que pourraient avoir vos installations?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about why people would worry in them, but
Et le primat du visuel dans votre œuvre, l'hégémonie absolue du visuel dans votre œuvre a quelque chose d'inquiétant, d'orwellien.
Well, I think in this particular project, I was trying to play along with the notion of classic Hollywood film and kind of push that along in different ways. So I used some really wonderful actors like Jim Fletcher, Sarah Kinlaw, and Constance de Jong, people who had a real flair for performance in different ways. And I also used a soundtrack by J.G. Thirlwell, who's known as Fetus, and kind of a very interesting performer known as a kind of punk, post-punk, industrial sound. But we wanted to also to bring a sort of seductive quality to it, because intentionally I wanted to use the kind of vehicle of a sort of Hollywood movie to bring people into the story, to bring them into a way of bringing these characters to life, because they're so obscure. I thought there would be something wonderful about taking these very obscure characters and having them have a kind of believability. And it was really just a kind of dream to see that happen, to see these characters play out. Because in the archive, I was kind of imagining the relationships between them, but then to write it in such a way that they had a kind of veracity for the public. Although this quickly breaks down, and I think that this is part of it. It comes back to the technology and the space of the archive. So it kind of breaks back down into the field of history and technology at the same time.
Très pris et très gêné par la poussière. Juste une dernière question. Le titre est très beau, l'impondérable. Comment vous avez trouvé ce titre?
I stumbled upon, as I was working on this project, I realized that I should bone up on some of the science that was happening around, the past 200 years of science. So I got a number of books by, the great courses in science and kind of read up on Newton and Faraday and people like this, and to try to really dial in, like, okay, when was particle physics happened when, so it happened much, and a lot of these things kind of happened much earlier than I thought they did, so almost concurrently with a lot of this psychic activity, people in physics were discovering really a lot of incredible stuff. And if you look back at even the way that Isaac Newton, who's everybody knows what many of his achievements, and that there was a kind of this notion that there's the known science and then there's the unknown science, and we can only have some conjecture about what this is, but we can sort of prove this to think about that, and that there's an edge of where knowledge actually falls off, and we no longer have any idea of that. So this edge is quite an interesting edge, and one can argue about that, but it's unprovable. So this edge has always existed in the history of science, and it's kind of metaphorical position that it has existed in the history of the world, where there's a limit to the edge of the knowledge, and people called it ether, or people called it the void, or people called it outer space, or people ignored it, that it was kind of the existential blank. But the notion used in the 1800s, they had this wonderful word, in the 1800s called the imponderable. It's also lovely in French. So that edge, bringing up that edge seemed to be just a wonderful way of encapsulating the project, because it seemed like all these, if you leaf through the archive and you see Heaven's Gate cult, who believed that they were going to be taken up in a comet if they all committed suicide at the right time, that they would hitch onto the Hale-Bopp comet and just keep going into outer space. How people get to these positions time and time again, and it just keeps happening. It's imponderable, but we have to think about it.
Bien, très bien. Merci beaucoup. Merci à Tony. Merci à vous d'être présent après une soirée qui s'est terminée très tard. Le prochain rendez-vous est cet après-midi à 16h autour de la collection de pochettes de disques. Il y aura les commissaires qui seront présents et c'est Damien Saucé qui fera la conversation. Voilà. Et moi, je vous donne rendez-vous demain matin. Bonne journée.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming.